When I was a child, I used to love going to my grandma's house out in the country. We lived in a more urban area, so it was quite a treat to be away from civilization for a while. At least, that's kind of how I saw it. I also got to see all my cousins who lived out in the country as well, and there was so much to do that was different than usual. My grandma lived in a small hollow with heavily forested hills that we all really enjoyed exploring. We would often get lost on purpose and see how long it took us to find our way back home. Not long after my 12th birthday, my parents took us for a trip to go see Grandma. It was in the early fall, which was my favorite time to visit, and also my favorite time to explore. I just loved when it was cold enough outside that you had to wear a jacket but not quite a coat yet, and the sound of the scrunching and crunching of leaves as they were crushed under my feet. Not to mention that with autumn, there was that wonderful smell that comes when the trees are barren, carried by the chilly breeze. Well, on this particular visit, my cousins Jessica and Phil, who were about the same age as me, were also very eager to go out and explore. We all set out after noon, immediately after we'd had our lunch. It didn't take very long until we all got lost. After a while and a lot of exploring, we eventually found our way to a gravel road that none of us were familiar with. Interested in seeing where it led, we followed it but stayed to the side of it. We were always careful not to walk in the road, just in case a car came by and didn't see us or something. A lot of times, the people driving on country gravel roads can be pretty careless about their driving habits. Well, eventually, walking on the road, we came up to a small bridge. It was one of those bridges that was really just a part of the road with a big metal tunnel underneath it. It was obviously there just because there was a small creek, and it was allowing that creek to run through. "Hey, do you want to go to the tunnel?" they asked me. "Yeah, that sounds like fun," I agreed. "Let's see how fast we can run through it. You know, last one there's a rotten egg." And yeah, I really did say that. All three of us began to run off the side of the road. We were fast approaching that tunnel. Before we got there, though, we were very surprised when a human hand and head popped out from the inside. We stopped in our tracks and looked at the man before us. He was an older, scruffy man who looked like he hadn't bathed in forever. He was actually wearing what looked like an old and very dirty top hat. His beard was gray and unkempt, and he was wearing a jacket that was a really dirty brown tweed. When he saw the three of us, he smiled a grin that had about 3 teeth in it. "Hey kids, you want to play with my dogs?" he asked immediately, quite excitedly. Well, none of us were sure what to do. Of course, our parents had always told us that we shouldn't talk to strangers. However, they had also taught us that we should always show our elders respect, and this man was definitely an elder. Now, while it might seem like his appearance should have put us off, it really didn't. We had plenty of relatives who really didn't look much better than he did. Now, being that I was the one who usually took charge, I decided to answer him this time. "No, that's okay. We're just outside exploring. We should really be getting back to our grandma's house now." "Oh, are you lost?" the man asked us, still smiling. He was still mostly standing inside the tunnel, and all we could really see was his head and the arm that was held up against the side as he leaned out. "No, we're not lost. We were just hiking," I replied. I knew enough that you should never let a stranger know when you were lost. The man just looked at us, still smiling that toothless smile, and repeated his question once more. "Well, do you want to play with my dogs?" We all looked at each other. Of course, we were very uncomfortable at this point. I was feeling very nervous in my stomach, but I really didn't want the others to know that. I knew we all wanted to leave, but we were taught to show respect to our elders, and he wasn't ready to let us leave yet. None of us answered. The man kept smiling and repeated his question again. Oh, not knowing what else to do, Jessica asked him, "Well, how many dogs do you have?" The man kept smiling. "I have 5 dogs, and they really love to play with kids. So, do you want to play with my dogs?" Perhaps realizing the man was not going to quit asking us until we agreed to at least see them, we finally agreed to his demands. Come on, right over here. They're just in the tunnel." The man smiled and stepped back into the tunnel out of sight. We began to walk over to him. "So, what sort of games or tricks do your dogs do?" I asked as we approached the entrance. Well, as the three of us came around, we were able to see inside the tunnel. We saw the most vile and disgusting thing any of us had ever seen in our lives. Several dogs, and it looked like far more than 5, were lying dead in a pile in the middle of that tunnel, stacked on top of each other. They'd obviously been dead for a good long time and reeked, as well as being covered with flies. They were all tattered and decayed. Several of them were even in different stages. The man, however, was standing beside them, and that smile never left his face. Then he told us, "Oh, well, they only really know how to play dead." He narrowed his eyes and asked for the final time, "So, do you kids want to play with my dogs?" Well, needless to say, our respect for our elders was thrown right out the window. The three of us booked it out of there like there was no tomorrow. I heard the man screaming after us, "Come back and play with my dogs, kids. They love children." Fortunately for us, the man did not try and follow us. We were winded long before we made it home, but we never stopped until we got there. And that was the last time I ever went exploring at Grandma's. When I was younger, we used to go to my aunt's house and spend a month or two there in the summer. It was a lot of fun, actually. She lived out in the country in a nice, mildly wooded area. It was great for playing things like hide and seek with my one and only cousin. My family lived in the city, and I really would not have had it any other way. But what was so great about going to my aunt's house for a month or so was that I could have fun in the country without actually having to live there. Now, when I was 14 though, I had an experience which really soured me on those whole country visits. It was an early July day, and my dad had just dropped me off the preceding day. I'd been too tired to really do anything of note when I arrived, but after a good night's rest, I was ready on the second day to go out and play with my cousin. Not surprisingly, we decided to play a game of hide and seek. Yeah, it's pretty weird playing it with only 2 people, but we didn't really care. It was fun, and it gave us an opportunity to change up the rules a bit. There was no running back to base to be safe. One of us would count to 100 while the other one hid. The counter, the one who was it, would have 30 minutes to find the hider. If he was successful, then the hider would then be it. If not, we'd just start a new round. On or around the 3rd round of play that day, my cousin was it, and I ran off to hide. We liked to make the game as challenging as possible, so the person who was it would count to 100 as slowly as they could. Then they would generally walk around and sometimes try to talk to the hider. Kinda make them nervous or get some sort of reaction that would reveal where they were. This time I ran way off into the woods and soon found myself a big rock to hide behind. It was right beside a depression in which a small creek was running. I had never actually seen this area before and figured this would be a great place to hide. I didn't think my cousin would ever find me. Well, I was right. For about 20 minutes, I sat there watching the water in the creek run. A couple of salamanders were running on the rocks, and I enjoyed watching them play around. But as I did that, I finally heard a noise out in the woods. It was a snapping, as if a twig had just cracked. I grinned even as I knew my cousin was near. Time was not on his side. "Where are you?" I heard a tiny voice in the distance. He was talking in a high, taunting voice like he always did. "Ollie, ollie, oxen free," he sang in a sing-song sort of tone. "Like I'm gonna come out for that," I whispered under my breath. I heard his feet as they crunched through the leaves on the ground. They were getting closer to me. I quietly glanced down at my watch, looking to see that I had 5 more minutes before I would win. Come out, wherever you are! I'm gonna find you!" I heard him call out in that high voice. The footsteps got a lot closer to me, and I felt like I was going to lose right at the last moment. I grimaced, expecting to see my cousin looking around the rock. I tried my best to hold very still. "Come out!" I heard him call. After a moment, though, a tense moment in which I completely expected him to find me, I heard the leaves crack again as he began walking away from me. Just when I was about to congratulate myself, I felt a vibration in my pocket. Although I jumped at first, I was able to contain myself without making too much noise. It seemed my cousin was desperate, and he was trying to call me on my cell phone, hoping the ringtone would alert him to where I was. I quickly grabbed the phone to stop the vibration and saw it was a text message, not a call. Looking at it, it said, "Hey, Scott, I twisted my ankle and had to hobble back home. I can't look for you right now, so just come on home, okay?" I paused and then heard the steps coming back toward me. I heard the voice, which I knew now was not my cousin's. "Ollie, ollie, oxen free, Scott. Come on out." Whoever this was not my cousin, but they knew my name. At first, I thought it would be best to just wait this out. Whoever it was had come so close to the rock and left. If he kept talking, I would probably know where he was, and if he came close, I could try and get away. Immediately after thinking that, though, I heard, "I know you're behind that rock. Come on out, Scott." I heard the crunching get closer to me, and I realized this person knew where I was. I only had one choice. I jumped up and thrust myself forward and ran like hell without ever looking back. I never saw who it was, not a single glance. I didn't need to know. I just ran and didn't stop until I got back to the house. When I arrived and felt like I was safe, I explained to my aunt what had happened. Needless to say, she did not let us go out into the woods anymore that summer. I told her how strange it was that whoever this man was, he knew my name and seemed to be taunting me. He obviously knew where I was hiding the whole time, and tried to make me believe he didn't. My aunt didn't seem too disconcerted though, but she never really explained why. She just always maintained that it would be best for us to stay inside that summer. This is by far the weirdest experience I'd ever had in my life. I grew up in a military family for the first 12 years of my life. When my dad decided to retire, he bought a house out in rural Tennessee. It was a very difficult adjustment for me, but not for the reasons you might think. Being the child of a military officer, I was moved around quite a lot growing up, so it wasn't really difficult moving away from friends or starting at new schools because I had done it so many times before. The hard thing about the move to the country was that it was a complete environmental change. I had previously lived only on military bases where there were a plethora of kids to make friends with. My dad bought a house that was pretty well off the beaten path, as I remember the nearest home being a half-hour drive away. Although I knew I'd make some friends at school, there weren't going to be any kids around me to hang out with at home, so I was going to have to find a way to entertain myself. The activity that I found I enjoyed the most was exploring the woods around the house. I could go out several times a week and just wander around for hours. I'd very rarely go to the same place twice. It was a vast wooded area I lived in, and I really enjoyed exploring it. There were creeks and hills and rocks and even caves. I even came across a waterfall once too. Well, on this particular day, I'd been out exploring for a while and had actually gotten quite lost. That wasn't too big of a deal. I mean, it had happened to me before. I really didn't have any good scouting ability, but usually if I just wandered enough, I would get back to where I was going. After a bit of time, I actually came across an old and apparently abandoned house just sitting right there smack dab in the middle of these woods. Now, this wasn't the first time I'd come across a building though. There'd been some rundown old sheds or old barns just completely eaten up by the elements. But this was more interesting because this was an actual house and it was not as bad off as all the other buildings had been. The house itself was a 2-story affair, but the roof was pretty much all gone. It was covered in chipped white paint that was peeling off the old brick walls. All of the windows were completely busted out, which I assumed happened long after it was abandoned, because they had apparently never been boarded up. The front door was long since gone as well, and there was moss growing on the front of the building in certain areas. Now, I probably shouldn't have, but I immediately wanted to take a look inside this building. Unlike most of the others I'd come across, it was not completely run down. Walking up to it, I walked through the doorway and into the interior of the front room. It was obviously a living room and even had some extremely worn down and rotting furniture in it still. The floor, however, was very solid, so I walked on it with no problem. Looking up, I saw there were these huge holes in the ceiling, and the back wall of the house was pretty much all gone. Still, I was completely fascinated. After peeking around at the leftover furnishings and other items, I finally found my way over to the staircase. I pressed my foot against the bottom step and found it was completely solid. So I began to walk up the steps, very carefully, each time making sure to test each step before fully putting my weight down on it. Each stair creaked, of course, but even though it made me feel nervous, I was now somewhat exhilarated. My sense of adventure had been piqued. When I got to the top, I found my heart beating hard in my chest. I looked around to see if any of the rooms had strong and solid enough floors for me to walk on. There was one room that seemed alright. When I walked into it, I noticed it was a girl's room. Like the other rooms, it still had a lot of furniture in it. I walked over to the vanity, and it had half the mirror still intact. After looking at my cracked reflection, I looked down at the vanity itself. There were some combs and a brush and even some hair berets lying on the shelf. I fumbled through the items when I saw something really strange. There seemed to be an old journal lying on top of it. Somehow it hadn't been completely destroyed by the elements, so I picked it up and started to flip through it. The book itself was really weird. It wasn't really writing as much as it was a lot of stick figure drawings. The majority of them were of a girl. I knew that because she had a little triangle drawn for her dress. But there was also this huge thing labeled Daddy, but it wasn't a person, and it wasn't a stick figure either. It was a big, vile-looking beast, like something from Where the Wild Things Are. In some of the pictures, the girl was holding its hand, and in others, she was running away from it. Still, and even more, she was hiding from it. Well, I figured if this journal was written by a little girls can be pretty imaginative, and that's probably all it was. That's a bit odd, I told myself as I sat the book back down. I then heard a strange creaking noise right behind me. Nervous at first, I jumped and spun around, but didn't see anything. I told myself, it's just an old house. Probably hadn't had anybody in it for a long time. It was just reacting to me being there. Looking around some more, I saw there was a closet, so I walked over to it. There were a lot of old clothes, little girls' clothes of course, hanging there ruined, molded, and mildewed. Above the hangers there was a shelf, and I saw some items up there. I stood on my tiptoes and reached my hand up. As I moved, I accidentally knocked a tennis ball off the shelf. It fell to the floor and rolled across to the middle of the room. I went to go pick it up. As soon as I crouched down next to the bed, I found myself suddenly face to face with a young girl who was obviously hiding. She was wearing a white dress with a red belt and a red handkerchief in her hair. She was completely clean and groomed, a stark contrast to everything else that was there. She looked me in the eyes very panicked and put a finger to her lips. Shh, Daddy's looking for me. I really had no idea what to think in this situation, but my fight or flight instinct kicked in and chose flight. I jumped up, ran to the stairs, got down the entire staircase in 2 huge strides, and jetted out the front door. I did not look back at that dilapidated house as I ran and ran. Unfortunately, since I'd just run aimlessly into the woods, I ended up getting myself even more lost, and it took quite a while for me to get home. Eventually, though, I did make it there, the entire time nervously looking around. I expected to see the little girl or her daddy somewhere out in the woods. I didn't tell anyone about the experience when I got home. I really didn't know what to think about it. I mean, it wasn't as scary as it was weird. I mean, even if there really was no daddy, I'd just seen a young girl hiding under a bed in a long abandoned house in the middle of the woods. It was completely creepy. Needless to say, I never went hiking in that area ever again. This is a long one, guys, but it's well worth the read. It really freaked me out at the time. If anyone has a solid idea of what this was or if they've had a similar experience, I would love to hear it. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I've always liked to camp alone. There's something so serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I've always just found it really relaxing. So I planned out what trail I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles until I found exactly the right spot. I headed off the trail and found a place to put my tent up. I stumbled upon this nice-sized clearing and decided it was a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I was really exhausted at this point, but I set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing, right next to the tree line, and I managed to get a fire going as well. I roast up some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal or something, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking or dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was already getting dark, so I really couldn't go find it and put it out of its misery. I thought nothing of it after that and went about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decided though that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I still couldn't go to sleep. I pulled out a book I had brought with me and started to read by the light of my lamp. The hours go by though, and I hear that sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listened to this animal drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point. It sounded like something was being heavily planted with the dragging noise following shortly after, like it was dragging something along. It made it to what I assume was about the middle of the clearing and stopped, and then I heard nothing else. No breathing, not even a sound from this animal. I unzipped the tent and looked into the clearing, but I couldn't see anything but trees and darkness. What the fuck? Unnerved at this point, I zipped the tent back up and sit there listening for any other noises. Nothing, just the crickets and the breeze. I decided that there were a lot of strange noises in the woods at night and tried not to let it bother me. Besides, I had my rifle with me for protection. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, and then women's laughter, sticks snapping far off to my left as well. I'm bolt upright now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. I hear more laughing coming from other directions, all of them different. Old men, old women, even children I hear. I confirmed that it was real. The noises were closing in. I grabbed my rifle, preparing to fire a warning shot in the air in case they came too close. Something about this laughter, how far in I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night told me this was not just another family that happened to be strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. It didn't even seem like the wind was making any noise. I decided enough is enough. I unzipped my tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intensely to my surroundings. No laughing, and the forest sounds had all returned, it seemed. Relaxing just a bit and figuring I'd scared whoever it was off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety. It was still dark outside. I immediately heard two people whispering not too far from my tent. Alert, I grabbed my rifle and listened to what they were saying. I couldn't make out very much, but I heard something about being lost. I shouted out, "Hey, who's there?" The voices all fell silent. I shout again, "Are you guys lost? Do you need help or something? Who's there?" Suddenly, a huge burst of flame, like somebody was carrying a flamethrower or something, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people just standing around my tent. In shock, I fired my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and everything went dark. Without checking my surroundings, I got up and sprinted out of there, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise all the way back to my truck, with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the whole way, but I just could not shake the feeling the entire time that I was still being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me like I'd left all my gear in the woods that night.